Now, the next presentation, as I said, we are going to the west, is from New York, from Guy Nordenson. But in fact, he also was crossing the Atlantic, born in Paris and raised, first of all, in the European context. Now he is at home very much in the American context, but so some crossing border we can find in this CV as well. Guy Nordenson is not only a structural engineer, he is also a professor for architecture and structural design at Princeton University, and certainly we know him also because of many structures, maybe not so much bridges, it's more the museum, big cultural buildings, which we can find in his oeuvre. But also what we find here is that he is somebody who is preparing a space for discussion, more or less, while he is creating or curating exhibitions, organizing conferences, so creating the spaces to exchange ideas, to have the place to look over our borders and get new inspiration. On in the engineering side, he would say started more or less classical with something very strong engineering tasks like earthquake engineering, doing a lot of research there. But then shifting more and more towards requirements we have today, the climate adaptation and in New York, the flood hazard migration research. It's always a great inspiration to talk with Guy not only about engineering and this task, but also to have the art included, to have the philosophical approach, to learn about the approaches, the interests of architects, and maybe to learn to see the things different. Guy, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Actor and author, The Wild, Wild West.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mike, for including us here. It's been a great pleasure all day to listen to these incredible talks. I noted earlier somebody said that the fact that there were 2 Swiss talks meant that you like Switzerland. So I take it that you also like the US, because there are 2 of us from there. I hope so. I'm going to read because I know there's limited time and I wanted to make sure I stayed on schedule. My title alludes to the classic film theory known as auteur theory, which emerged in the 1950s in France, and to the mid-1960s TV series, The Wild, Wild West. Some of you may be old enough to remember this. And its 1999 remake with Salma Hayek, Kevin Kline, and Will Smith. For those of you familiar with the Mission Impossible TV and film series, The Wild Wild West was a Western version conceived at the same time in the same CBS studios. Many actors appeared in both. Bill Baker and I are both here representing the Western end of the day, and I think you will agree ours is a pretty Wild West these days. My talk is in 5 parts. The first part is inspired by this quote from the poet William Carlos Williams, and I'll let you read these quotes that I put up here. I won't read them to you. I know that all of us reflect on what we do and embody ideas in our structures. In the book Anti-Intellectualism in America, Richard Hofstadter offers a definition of the intellectual as one who thinks of ideas as having a life and a value of their own, is interested in the movement of ideas, in their history, and in the influence of ideas on people and events. We make often beautiful forms from ideas: suspension, continuity, optimization, equilibrium, turbulence, interdependence, stability, and instability are characteristics of the physical world that are expressed in structural form. The results are apparent in all the talks we've heard today. But not all ideas and structures find a form that we can see with our eyes. In fact, many of the finest ideas are hidden, are sublimated beyond perception. Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center, the buildings that were sadly destroyed, were one example. We prepared this drawing of the perimeter structure, which is now in the museum's collection, for the tall building exhibitions that I co-curated there 20 years ago. That exhibition put on view selected tower models as well as their full sections. Many were chosen to reveal what was out of sight. I included 2 of Bill Baker's wonderful designs in that exhibition, especially showing how the structure was revealed in section. The section and construction photos are commonly the only way structural ideas can be discovered. A practice like that of Les Robertson is reticent. It is aligned with the conceptual arts that are associated in the art world with Marcel Duchamp. They play on puns, wit, and double entendre. The drawing of the towers first revealed the distribution of 14 different steel strengths that were used to make the box columns and spandrel beams. All the beams and columns in this structure were the same. All had the same outer dimensions, and all the steel plate beams had the same height. This was an important conceit in structural design, not to reflect the accumulation of forces, but to repress it in a minimalist sameness. Robertson used the higher strengths to reduce the plate thickness and shed forces away from the corners of the tube into the body of each face. So he was painting, in a sense, with the steel types that he was using. Since the forces reflect the varying combination effect of the wind and the weather, the terrain and the pairing of the 2 towers, which shield each other in certain wind directions, what you see is the overlay of his design intent and the environment. Characteristically, Les was surprised when I showed him this drawing. The critic I.A. Richards in The Philosophy of Rhetoric wrote, "When we use a metaphor, we have 2 thoughts of different things active together and supported by a single word or phrase whose meaning is a resultant of their interaction. The Statue of Liberty is a metaphor. As you know, the structure, which was first to be by Viollet-le-Duc, is the work of Gustave Eiffel. It is the first central core stiffened structure that I'm aware of, and the first to support a true curtain wall. The form of the statue is made of 310 copper plates, 2.5 millimeters thick, that were repoussés on wood forms in a fabrication shop built in Paris for that purpose. On site, each plate is independently supported off the core on outriggers. They slide relative to each other. They really are a kind of tree, if you like, with the leaves held up by branches. The statue is a metaphor in meaning and a metaphor in fact. It is made of 3 distinct parts, each with its own auteur, Eiffel, Bartholdi, and Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt made the base. It represents 3 actors in performance of an idea, liberty. The great French auteur-filmmaker François Truffaut based his early work on his own life. From 1959 to 1979, he made 5 films, Les 400 coups, Antoine et Colette, Baiser volé, Domicile conjugal, and L'amour en fuite. Each stages the same actor, Jean-Pierre Léaud, playing Antoine Donnel in a role based on Truffaut's life. Unlike a novelist, Truffaut had to resort to an actor. The result is a doubling of his person on either side of the camera. We are aware of this, and this dialectic produces the magic of the film. Truffaut's appearance in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Steven Spielberg's movie, further makes use of this doubling for uncanny and witty effect. Close Encounters was filmed between May 1976 and February 1977, and L'amour en fuite, which is where the last picture came from, in spring, summer 1978. Their productions overlapped. Spielberg imbued Truffaut's character, Claude Lacombe, a French scientist and UFO specialist, with not just the foreignness of his accent, which is quite noticeable in that film, in the middle as it takes place, in the middle of the Wild West, but with this inter-film echo. Truffaut, the auteur, very much exists in the film, to quote the Kale quote that I just showed you. If you think about it, certain actors have also returned over and over in Spielberg's films, including everyman Tom Hanks and the enigmatic Mark Rylance. The repeated presence of actors in, this is Hitchcock with Truffaut, the repeated presence of actors in auteur films colors our experience and expands the meaning. You can see this throughout cinema, from Hitchcock to Orson Welles to George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, and Quentin Tarantino. Their films are compound, metaphoric constructions. I find the film analogy helpful in explaining how I see and interpret architecture. You could as easily look at opera and theater. I find it striking how naive and how unhelpful architectural criticism is in this regard. We hear words all about collaboration, but no specifics. Critics will claim that architecture is different than these other media because you cannot see the other actors' work in a building. The structure is hidden. Or you don't see the clever natural air circulation, so you can't admire or critique. But there are other ways of knowing. After all, the acoustics are often noted. Sadly, critics are mostly blind to what Peter Rice, channeling John Ruskin, called la trace de la main. Let's concede that every made landscape, bridge, or building must have a director. That will be the architect, a landscape or building architect, an engineer, and we've heard from many engineer auteurs today, and at times an artist. They decide and select. The program is usually set by others. In his Patterns of Intention, the art historian Michael Baxendale beautifully compares the Fourth Bridge by John Fowler and Benjamin Baker with Picasso's portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, the dealer, the art dealer that he worked with. He built the case that the ends may differ, but the methods are the same. Each work has an auteur, and each engages other leading actors. I recommend Baxendale's book, by the way. I could mention many other examples in our domain, from the Sydney Opera House to the Munich Olympic Stadium, where key actors left their ideas and traces, both plainly visible and not. Some were only briefly on the stage, but their ideas remained. Many of you in the room have directed projects of your own and also played parts in those led by others. Each position carries different responsibilities, opportunities, and stress. The film or opera analogy suggests also the potential of building as performance. We are all taken by great images of construction. Some enter the legend of a project like those of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Sydney Opera House, or Mannheim Multihall. They present the daring and grandeur of the work, the nerve of it all. Some performances are less well known, but should be. The construction of the Louvre Pyramid is a good example. Peter Rice played a key role devising the stiff ziggurat that you can see through there on the inside, scaffolding off of which the pyramid tensegrity was tensioned. If you can imagine, building that tensegrity structure holding the glass was not simple, and in fact, Pei was told to bring in Peter Rice and others to help him. This has rarely been shown, however, because Pei did everything to ensure that the pyramid looked like magic. Remember, if you look down at the bottom right, the image of these lines that he used to convince Mitterrand and the public to let him build on this sacred ground. You don't see the crane that's holding up those strings. The magic of it was a key element, so sometimes the process disappears. I've often designed structures such that their construction becomes a performance on purpose. At my alma mater, MIT, I developed a prefabricated concrete structure in keeping with the architect Stephen Hall's concept of sponge that was both practical and theatrical. I had an appreciative audience among the students at MIT. Hall and I have gone on to build many other similarly performative structures made of large blocks stacked up and bound together. This is an art school that we completed recently in Houston. In Rome, I persuaded the team for the Jubilee Church, designed by Richard Meyer, that we should build it out of large blocks of precast concrete. This was different than the original conception of a steel structure clad in metal panels, and it created this long, slow process of construction, which I think delighted everyone who lived around it and watched this thing get built like a giant, almost like a giant toy. Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in America gives a good account in the mid-18th century of the first awakening just before the American Revolution. The period featured many passionate revivalist preachers that deprecated ideas and reason. They spoke passionately of their faith as transcending mere reason. The American philosopher-theologian Jonathan Edwards, whose quote is here, a more cautious revivalist, said of some of the more extreme ones, quote, "Satan may deceive men with false impulses and counterfeit the influences of the Spirit of God by agitating their imagination and raising their passions while their understanding is not enlightened." We're seeing quite a lot of that right now. God is in the details, as Mies van der Rohe told us. There is comfort in materials and well-reasoned and crafted details, regardless of whether they are leading actors or more reticent ones. There is even a special pleasure in hiding the best parts or allowing only a fleeting glimpse. Many poets have alluded to this. You may remember that during the late 1960s and 70s in China, there was a practice of what Orville Schell and Antonio Finane called a pattern of interiorized fashion. While maintaining an outer sameness, special fabrics and patterns were sewn into the inner linings of individuals' mouth suits in order to internally feel difference and a sense of being special. This may seem strange in our world of social media, but it is a way to sidestep the glare and vulgarity of the wild, wild West. Let me briefly share a few examples before going to my final section. Both the Museum of Modern Art and the Toledo Museum Glass Pavilion were designed by Japanese architects accustomed to the careful craft of builders at home. Translating that to the Wild West was my charge. The goal in both these projects, which I'm not going to show in detail, but the goal there was basically to make the structure disappear and to make it appear to be standing, in both cases, just from the glass. Where museum galleries are naturally lit from above, the structure can provide a special character to the space. The Kimball marks a shift from the more technical layering of Piano's museums after the Menil in response to the vis-a-vis with Louis Kahn and Auguste Commandant. At Corning, the structure on the right, which I did with Tom Pfeiffer, the structure of paper-thin and long-span precast concrete rafters, they're about 6-7 centimeters wide and about 1.20 meters tall and span about 20 meters, does not seem structural at all. At the Menil Drawing Center in Houston, the canopy structure are made of thin, folded steel plates in the spirit of the origami-like architecture and museum contents. I was first in Berlin in 1989 during the competition for the Amerika Gedenkbibliothek with Stephen Hall and Stefan Schroch. This was one of my first projects with Stephen, and we nearly won. The children's library was a floating dirigible with an ephemerally ghostly structure, an idea we developed over the years, culminating in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, in my view, Stephen Hall's masterpiece. Later, I had the great pleasure of working with Tristram Carfrey in our young Ove Arup and Partners office in New York to design the Munich Airport Center and the Sony Center, which I think has changed its name. We chose to alternate glass and fabric to avoid the sometimes claustrophobia of fabric structures. But also, I snuck in a bit of Duchampian humor. The roof of the Sony Center, if you see it from above, is effectively the rising sun flag of Japan, though this has 24 rays, not the 16. In profile, the shape recalls Mount Fuji, and the flying tensegrity mast is the sword of Damocles, hovering overhead. I don't believe the clients, an American developer, and the Sony executives fully understood the play. This is the last thing I'll show you, but in order to illustrate a little bit what I think can be the magic of collaboration. We've heard today a lot from a large number of extraordinary structural artists whose work is what you see. But there's another aspect of structural engineering that I guess I, in part, represent, which is how we collaborate, if you like, but collaborate in a meaningful way where there is a kind of separation between the music and the dance that I was alluding to with the Merce Cunningham quote. This is a sculpture that sits in the Hudson River outside of the Whitney Museum, which was the result of a drawing produced by an artist David Hammonds, who was invited to visit the museum as it was being completed. This is a museum designed by Renzo Piano, a new home for the Whitney Museum of Art downtown in the former meatpacking district. As he was walking around with the director Adam Weinberg pointed out that outside there was this extraordinary sculpture that had been made by Gordon Matta Clark by occupying this building and cutting these large holes in it. This pier had a very interesting history in the community. It was, for many years, a place to sunbathe and hang out. Years after it was abandoned, it was actually originally a pier for the German Hamburg line, which used it at the first part of the century. So long history associated with this, eventually abandoned and then occupied by Gordon Matta Clark, who made these cuts. And it was an extremely memorable work of art that only lasted 4 years before it burned down here in 1979. So the artist David Hammonds, who is very Duchampian, enigmatic, elusive artist, was walking around the museum and looking out the window, and Adam Weinberg, who we see here, said out there was where the Gordon Matta Clark was. A couple of months later, he sent this drawing to Adam Weinberg without any commentary. Just the drawing arrived in the mail. Adam interpreted it as a challenge to actually build this thing and proceeded to start the process of getting permits to build in the water, very complicated approvals process. And he asked me to work with him on the development of that idea into the structure that you see here. Our goal was really to basically produce a drawing in space, basically give you the sense of that drawing in the way in which this was realized in the final result. A couple of features of this: it's very thin. Each one of these bars is a circular tube. The ends are thicker than the middle, kind of like with a bicycle, and the width is 20 centimeters, and they span 20 meters. So it's 100 to 1 span to depth ratio, so very thin. And of course, the whole thing had to be cambered in 3 dimensions in order for it to end up flat and vertical. So a lot of invisible effort going into making something that has the abstraction of that drawing. The joints are cast. The joints itself are cast, and then there are tubes welded to it that reach out to these milled couplers that tie the bars together. They're just 2 pins connecting each bar, and that produces a moment connection at that point. Everything had to be seamless. Everything had to be essentially invisible. It wasn't possible for us to do any welding on site for environmental reasons, but also it would have been impossible to control the dimensions if we did anyway. The point is to make it appear as if it's a line in space. This is the casting that took place in southern Brazil. It's a super duplex steel, which I'm sure you're familiar with, highly corrosion resistant, but hadn't been used actually until that point in the United States, made actually by Laubed. The pieces came, the beams were all prefabricated in the columns with the little arms that I showed you, and then they fit together with the pins, so zero tolerance in this process. One of the things that we discovered as we were designing it was, of course, because of the thinness of these bars, they were susceptible to vortex shedding. So we had to go through a pretty detailed fatigue analysis to make sure that the welds that combine the parts, didn't have backing bars, didn't have any other features that would cause fracture due to that vortex shedding. I like the fact that it has that vortex shedding because that is essentially that little sort of shake that you get in a pencil line on a drawing. Thank you.
How was the reaction to the sculpture you made? So the critique, the society, was there any discussion? So did they like it? What's the reflection about that?
Generally positive. I mean, the articles in newspapers and magazines and so on. I mean, the artist has a tremendous reputation. So there was a lot of anticipation that led up to this. And so a lot of attention, a lot of articles written about the fact that this was a very large piece of his creation. I don't think much negative. I mean, a lot of people are puzzled who don't know much about it. They walk by it and they wonder what it is. So I think there's some of that as well, but nothing negative.
Yeah, but also positive or just...
Positive in the press, for
yeah.
sure, and positive in people that I've heard from.
Yeah, perfect. Is there a difference in working with architects in comparison to artists? Yeah, so... would you say there's a difference? Would you say one is more challenging than the other one, or maybe more enabling
I
possibilities?
don't think so. I think that there are differences between artists. There's another sculptor that I've been friends with for a long time, Martin Puryear, who's very specifically, and John Oxendorf has worked with him, who's very specific about every aspect of his work. David Hammonds is very removed. So I think that there are different ways in which artists relate to the production of their work, which, I mean, in a case like this, creates a challenge where you are basically interpreting the work and doing the best you can to operate in the spirit of it, which is kind of what I'm driving at. Is if you think historically at a lot of different projects that we all know about, there are situations where the idea lives long past the originator of that idea. And so how does that work? How do people marshal the creativity, not just to execute the idea, but to interpret the idea in a way that is convincing? And that's a large part of, I think, what happens. And we don't get enough accounting of that as we get in a lot of other disciplines.